introduce to you now our keynote speaker, Dr. David Wratt, and I have a few notes on him. They were kind of heavy. Couldn't bring them all, David, just quietly. He's a pretty amazing guy, actually. He's Chief Scientist of Climate at NIWA and in Wellington. And he's also Director of New Zealand Climate Change Research Centre. He's the Chair of the Royal Society of New Zealand's Climate Committee. He's the Vice Chair of the Working Group of the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He leads the Commission on Climatology's expert team on climate and energy. There's a whole other paragraph. I don't have to say it all. He can tell you later if he wants to over a glass of wine. Recent publications include regional climate change projections, scenarios, impacts and adaptation, economic implications of projected climate changes for New Zealand pastoral agriculture, mountain influences on weather, climate and river flows. As a Taranaki girl, I know a little bit about that. Not really. All in all, well, we do know a little bit up there. All in all, not bad for a Motueka High School boy. You can take the boy out of Mott. I would like to welcome a very wonderful man, a very intelligent, well-spoken young man. His name is Dr. David Wratt.
Well, thank you very much, Katrina, for that very kind introduction. And I must say, although I've lived on and off in Wellington for about 30 years, I still feel as if Motueka and Nelson's my home, so I'm very pleased to be here. And I should also say, as a climate scientist who's been working in this area of climate change for 20 or 30 years now, some of the things I'll be telling you about soon, I have become very concerned about the issues of climate change. And I think it's also true that the people that are going to have to address these issues are actually people that live in communities. So I think Code Red is a wonderful initiative, both for business, and I think I've also been interested to see some of the things that businesses around Nelson are doing in terms of making various technologies and solar heating and all these sorts of advice and so on available for people as well. So it's very encouraging. So yeah, I wish you all the best with Code Red. So now I've just got to try and get my computer going so I can talk to you. Hopefully it'll stop, it'll wake up. Yes, here we go. Yeah, so what I was asked to do was to talk to you a bit about climate change and some of the science. I guess why it is that we need to do things like Code Red. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've observed to change in the climate, how the climate has changed both internationally and right down at the local level in Nelson. What we expect to happen in the future, why we are concerned as scientists about climate change and why we think we really do need to do something, the sorts of targets that are being talked about internationally, and then a bit about reducing emissions, which is mitigation, and I'll try and make sure to leave plenty of time, so if you've got questions I'll do my best to answer them. And this little picture here, often when you hear people talk about climate change, you tend to think about global warming, things getting hotter. But another thing that's very important, and that's something we're quite concerned about in NIWA, is that as the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, the amount of carbon dioxide in the oceans goes up as well, and that makes the oceans more acid. And in fact, what's becoming realised is that some of the ocean ecosystems, things that make use of calcium carbonate to make their shells and what have you, things like deep water corals, for example, which we have quite a lot of around New Zealand, are potentially quite vulnerable as well. So climate change is not only a concern in terms of what it might do to the atmospheric climate, there are also concerns about what might happen to some of the ecosystems in the ocean, which is developing. We don't know very much about that yet, but it's an important issue, so that's why the little picture there. So, first of all, I probably don't need to persuade too many of you in the audience about this, but the climate really is changing. This is our best estimate of what the temperature of the world's done from 1840 on the left-hand side of the picture right through till 2007 was the last thing there. And from around 1906 through to 2005, the world warmed up by about 3/4 of a degree. which mightn't seem very much, but the difference between an ice age and normal conditions in the world is about 5 degrees, so that's a significant change for the world. The other thing that I spend quite a bit of time on at times is people answering challenges and questions from people that tell me, well look, it's actually been cooling since 1998, so we don't need to worry about climate change, it's all going to come out all right. Well, I think what you can see there is that certainly temperatures have been fluctuating around. It's not as if it's just a straight line going up. And you can see that, see if I stand here, that 1998 was the warmest year we've had. It depends a bit whose analysis of the data you look at. 2005 in some analyses was about as warm. But what we're seeing here is that we've got natural fluctuations. When there are El Niños, it's a bit warmer because of the way heat gets redistributed in the oceans. This was an El Niño year. When we have La Niñas, like we've had recently, that makes the world a little bit cooler. So that we've got an overall upward trend here, which, as I'll talk about later, is pretty certainly due to increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we have fluctuations on top. And I think it would be a very brave person who said that because there was a little spike here and it's been a bit cooler here, we don't need to worry about climate change. We can see lots of times in the past where it's been a little bit cooler for a few years and then it's warmed up again. And certainly the science that we know about the climate suggests that that's what's happening here and that we are going to see more warming again as the century progresses. And in fact, as I'll explain, if we keep putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the rate we are now, we'll expect to see substantially more warming than what we've seen over the last 100 years. It's not only the temperature that's going up. Sea level went up by about 17 centimetres, averaged around the globe over the last century, and it went up more last century than it had in the previous century. You've probably seen the stuff from the newspapers, pictures and so on about the floating ice in the Arctic, that the amount of ice at the end of summer in the Arctic has been decreasing. Last summer was the second to lowest amount of ice that's happened, and the summer before that was the lowest. The oceans have warmed right down to 3,000 metres or so. It's not just the air that's warming up. And as I mentioned already, as the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up, the oceans have got a bit more acid, and we expect that to continue. Been changes in what we call precipitation patterns, that's snow and rainfall, and also in some particularly northern hemisphere areas there's been more very heavy rainfall, but also in some continental locations there's been more drought. And at least in some places there's been not necessarily more tropical cyclones, but there've been more very strong tropical cyclones. And obviously that's a major concern for the small island nations to our north. So, taking all of that into consideration, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I've been involved in, which is a process through which some of the best climate scientists around the world assessed what we know about climate change, they came to the conclusion in the big assessment report a couple of years ago that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. There's no question but that things are warming up. So when it comes down to New Zealand, this is the New Zealand temperature. It actually cooled down a little bit towards the end of last century. This is 1900 here, although we didn't actually have very many places we had measurements then. But from 1900 through till now, again, it's a bit more ups and downs than what there are when we average over the whole world. But New Zealand has warmed up as well. It warmed up. If you sort of draw a line, the best line through the last century, it warmed up by about 0.9 of a degree last century. So fairly similar to what's happened globally. And also the sea level's risen around New Zealand. This is from 1900 through to 2000. The wiggly line is the sea level up in the Waitemata Harbour in Auckland, and the other lines are actually some estimate of what's happened in Wellington and Lyttelton. So we've had about, similar to the global, 17 or 18 centimetres of sea level rise as well. So it's not just globally, we see these sorts of changes in New Zealand. And if we come on to Nelson, we've got quite a good long record from Appleby of what temperatures have done there, and I'm sorry this might not show up too well with the light behind, but essentially there's as you just go to one place and you're not averaging, there's a lot more natural fluctuations. But if you look at the overall red line here, and if you actually look at what's happening, Appleby, the temperatures rose by about 0.7 of a degree over the last 100 years or so as well. In terms of rain